Well, good evening. Good to see everybody here. My name is Kevin Woyce. I am an author and a photographer. So I'll be showing you a lot of pictures that I've taken over the years as we look into the history of the Jersey Shore. About 127 miles of islands and beaches, stretching all the way from the Gateway National Recreation Area, Sandy Hook, National Park Unit established in the 1970s. If you visit there, you'll still see the remains of gun batteries built to defend the approaches to New York Harbor. Fort Hancock was established there in the 1890s. And some of those batteries did remain in use through the end of the Second World War. During the Cold War, they were mostly replaced by Nike anti-aircraft missile bases. Be glad these were never needed. The later models, like this Nike Hercules, they were designed to carry nuclear warheads. That was all shut down in the 1970s. From there, all the way down to the southern tip of the state at Cape May Point, we also had some defenses there built during the Second World War. The government called it Fort Miles. And if an enemy fleet had approached, the guns along there would have been aimed using sightings from a line of what they called fire control towers. Concrete towers, the line stretched all the way from North Wildwood down to Bethany Beach on the Delaware coast. In fact, these two are located inside Delaware's Cape Henlopen State Park. While this one is near Cape May Point, preserved as a World War II memorial and museum, spiral stairway to the top. The earliest visitors to the Jersey Shore were the Lenni Lenape, the Native Americans who lived throughout New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, Delaware. None of the tribes lived year-round at the shore, but many would visit every summer, mostly to gather shellfish. And of course, fishing remains a popular reason for visiting the shore, whether you're fishing the inlets or from the beaches or the fishing piers. That one is on the beach in Avalon. You'll find similar structures in Ocean City and Belmar. Throughout the 19th into the early decades of the 20th century, sportsmen would also head to the shore for the bird hunting. Ducks and geese and shorebirds. They would head out early each morning into the salt marshes along the bays in shallow draft wooden sailboats they called sneak boxes. And these sportsmen, they didn't mind roughing it. What they called hotels in those days were just big rambling wooden buildings that looked more like barns than hotels. And they weren't built along the ocean front. They would be set well back from the ocean, usually in between the lines of sand dunes. It was quite a long time before the Jersey Shore became a vacation spot, largely because most of it was very difficult to get to until the second half of the 19th century, when the railroads began building bridges across the bays. Now, the first railroad that reached the Jersey Shore arrived in 1854. It was called the Camden and Atlantic. And when that railroad was being built, a lot of people thought the owners and the investors were losing their minds. They told them, "You're building a railroad to nowhere." And in a way they were. Their destination was a spot called Absecon Island. That was the old native name for it. There were a few houses on the bay shore, not much of anything else. But if you drew a straight line across New Jersey from the city of Philadelphia to the Atlantic Ocean, that was the shortest practical route. And Jonathan Pitney, he was one of the backers of that railroad. He wasn't concerned. In fact, he started a little town out on the island. You may even have heard of this place. Within a few years, Atlantic City would have 3 competing railroads, and also some of the biggest and best hotels along the shore. Although it didn't take the railroad owners long to realize that it was not enough just to lay tracks and publish a schedule. If you wanted to get people out to these beaches, you had to give them a reason to go there. So in a lot of the shore towns, it was the railroads that built the first hotels and many of the first attractions, including oceanfront pavilions, bathhouses, piers, even the forerunners of today's boardwalk amusement parks. And it may be a little hard to believe today when oceanfront property is worth a fortune, but for a long time, most of the Jersey Shore was considered almost worthless. Nobody wanted to buy out on these islands. You couldn't farm on the sand dunes or the beaches. And as late as 1880, when a man from Philadelphia named James Lafferty, he arrived on Absecon Island, bought a big piece of property south of Atlantic City, He called it South Atlantic City. He divided that into building lots and then put them up for sale. He was hoping people would buy this land to build summer homes. Now, most people would have put advertisements in the newspapers, maybe put up a billboard or two. Not James Lafferty. He built himself a 60-foot tall wooden elephant, covered it with tin plating, painted it white to begin with, but you could see his elephant for miles. You could see it from out on the ocean. You could see it from Atlantic City. You could see it across the bay. There were stairs in the back legs, so you could climb up inside. Once you were in there, another stairway led to a sort of pavilion up on top of the structure. From there, you could see all the land that Mr. Lafferty had to sell. Just one problem. Early 1880s, nobody was looking to build a summer home in South Atlantic City. The railroad didn't go there yet. There were no good roads to that part of the island yet. So by 1887, Lafferty was deeply in debt. The only way he could see out was to sell all of the land as cheaply as possible. He sold the elephant to John and Sophia Gertzen, husband and wife. They ran it as a tourist attraction for several decades. 10 cents a tour back then. The only elephant in the world you can go through and come out alive. One day somebody asked them about the elephant and Sophia said, "Lucy, she's been in the family for years." Never said where she got the name Lucy from. Lafferty had not named the elephant. But after the Gertzens, Lucy sat abandoned for a while, and by the 1960s, neighbors were calling for Lucy the eyesore to be torn down. Luckily, there were other people in Margate who had a little better idea. They formed the committee to save Lucy. They raised money, they bought a new piece of land for her, and even in this condition, they were able to raise the entire elephant onto a specially built flatbed with which they towed her 2 blocks through town to her new home where she was fully restored inside and out. Been there ever since as a tourist attraction, museum, National Historic Landmark. They've even rented out the interior a time or two on Airbnb. Those stairs lead to what was Mr. Lafferty's sales office. Was in the elephant's head, which means those 2 little round windows, those are the elephant's eyes. And although the Inn of Cape May, when it opened in 1894, the owners began advertising it as one of the shore's first year-round hotels. They had steam heating and gas lighting in every room. But most of the shore is still seasonal. Most of the towns empty out in the fall and come back to life in the spring. And for a good part of our history, the only people who lived year-round at the Jersey Shore were either lighthouse keepers or lifesavers. With Delaware Bay at one end, New York Harbor at the other, the Jersey Shore was one of the busiest stretches of the Atlantic coast. And the captains of sailing ships tended to stay close in to shore. So when the weather turned stormy, those waves could drive ships onto the beaches and smash them apart. And in fact, so many ships were lost along the Jersey Shore that sailors began to call it the graveyard of the Atlantic. Obviously, something had to be done to cut down the number of wrecks. So in the early 1760s, the merchants of New York City held 2 lotteries to raise money. They used that to buy a piece of land and to build a lighthouse to guide ships into their harbor. Now, they called this the New York Lighthouse, but I think you know it's here in New Jersey at Sandy Hook. Completed it in 1764, and they built it to last. During the American Revolution, which began just a few years later, the colonists wanted to disrupt British shipping in and out of New York. One of the ways they tried to do that was by firing their cannons at this lighthouse. Those stone walls are up to 10 feet thick. The cannonballs bounced right off. Tower is still standing and is the oldest lighthouse here in the United States, still in operation, with a 1,000-watt light bulb up at the top that shines 24 hours a day. The light is focused by an antique Fresnel lens made in France back in the 1850s. That was state-of-the-art at that time and a big improvement over the original lighting apparatus. In 1764, the lantern held 4 dozen wicks floating in 2 pans of oil. But because this tower is only a little over 100 feet tall, the light could not be seen all that far out to sea, which is why later on the government built the Navesink twin lights. And looking at the picture, you may think, well, they're not very tall either. They don't have to be. They stand on top of a 200-foot hill, the highest spot on the Atlantic coast. And they built the unusual double tower to create a unique signal that nobody would mistake for the Sandy Hook light a few miles to the north. Despite their nickname, the twin lights are not really twins. The south tower is square and the north tower is octagonal. If there was ever a reason for that, the only person who knew about it was the architect, and he never bothered to explain. The brownstone building connecting the towers was originally housing for 4 lighthouse keepers. These days it's a museum, and when the museum is open, so is the north tower, and you can climb the spiral stairway in there up to the top. Get some nice views from up there. Here we are looking across at the south tower. The south tower used to hold a giant rotating clamshell-shaped lens that made a flashing light. It's no longer in use. It's now displayed in a smaller building behind the lighthouse, which used to be the station's electrical generating plant. But when this was in place, you could see that flash from about 25 miles away, which made the twin lights one of New Jersey's 4 coastal lights. These were spaced about 40 miles apart along the coast, and with the exception of the twin lights, they were all designed or supervised by the same man. Army Corps engineer George Gordon Meade designed lighthouses for both New Jersey and Florida, but if the name is familiar, well, that's because he also led the Union Army to victory at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. You'll spot this monument outside of his Barnegat Lighthouse. Old Barney, built in 1859 at the north end of Long Beach Island, still in use. Climb to the top of the spiral stairway and you'll find yourself in what's called the watch room. This was where the keeper would work after dark. Several times a night, he would have to wind up the clockwork machinery, which is what kept the lens rotating to make the flashing light. The first lighthouse that Meade designed for New Jersey was completed just 2 years earlier in 1857. The Absecon Lighthouse, 171 feet tall, tallest in New Jersey, 3rd tallest masonry lighthouse in the United States. And if you visit, they're open almost every day of the year, they don't leave you a lot of doubt. Those spiral steps are numbered. When you get to the top, you know you've climbed all 228 of them. And just think, if you had been the lighthouse keeper, you were not done climbing at that point. They still had to go about another dozen steps in a ladder to actually get to the lantern. Because the lighthouse is still in use, the lantern is closed to visitors, but you can look up at it from the watch room. And what you see there is the very largest type of Fresnel lens, 12 feet tall, 6 feet in diameter. This lighthouse was closed down in the 1930s because by then, the other buildings along the Atlantic City Boardwalk were so big, some of them were blocking the light. And some of the attractions on the boardwalk were actually outshining it. This was the Traymore Hotel, completed in 1915, but torn down in the 1970s. Thankfully, the lighthouse has been fully restored and reopened as a museum back in 2000, complete with a replica of the original keeper's house, and it's now the centerpiece of Lighthouse Park, which runs right through the middle of Atlantic City, about 2 blocks off the boardwalk. Meade also supervised the design and construction of the lighthouse at Cape May Point. This one was completed and first lit in 1859, same year as Old Barney, also still in use. This lighthouse is surrounded by Cape May Point State Park, and here you've got 199 steps to the top of the spiral stairway. One of the great views from up there. The building with the red roofs is known as St. Marys by the Sea. It was built in the 1880s as the Shoreham Hotel. The Sisters of St. Joseph operated it as a religious retreat from 1909 until just a few years ago when there were concerns about beach erosion possibly washing that building away. The beach has been stabilized and the building is now being maintained by the nonprofit Cape May Point Science Center. Also at the top of the lighthouse, you'll see a rotating electric aero beacon. This makes a flashing light you can see from miles away. I can remember many evenings walking out onto the beach in Wildwood Crest. If you go out there after dark, look to the south, you'll see this light flash once every few seconds. This has been in use since the 1940s when the original lens was removed. That is now displayed at the Cape May County Museum on Route 9, which is right across the highway from the Cape May County Zoo. Also well worth a visit if you happen to be down that way. Today, all United States lighthouses are automated. There are no more lighthouse keepers. And it was not an easy job. You'd have to carry the oil up those spiral stairways to fill the lamps. Every morning you would have to clean the lantern glass and polish the lens. You were also responsible for maintaining the buildings and grounds, and that included painting that tower every so often. And there were no days off. The Tucker's Island Lighthouse used to be located on a smaller island just south of Long Beach Island. And Arthur Ryder kept that light shining until just a few hours before the ocean undermined it in 1927 and it collapsed into the waves. That series of pictures was taken by his nephew, who happened to be visiting at the time. Now, if you've not heard of Tucker's Island, it's because by the 1950s, the entire island had disappeared beneath the waves. But you can sort of visit the lighthouse. In 2000, this replica was built as part of the Tuckerton Seaport Museum. Several of the other museum buildings are also based on places that used to be either on Tucker's Island or Long Beach. But even with all of these lighthouses, ships continued to run aground during storms, when the fog rolled in, or sometimes just because it was nighttime. Before the shore was heavily developed, these islands were completely invisible after dark, and by the time you could see or hear the waves breaking on the beach, you were probably too close. This is the Cyndia. She was an iron-hulled sailing ship that ran aground on the beach in Ocean City in December of 1901. Had been headed for New York City with a Christmas-time cargo of vases and china and other curiosities from the Far East. The crew made it safely ashore, and after the ship's owners settled with the insurance company, a local businessman bought the wreck and any remaining cargo. He then had a bridge built from the Ocean City Boardwalk out to the Cyndia and hired a diver to go down into the flooded holds and bring up the cargo, which he would then sell to tourists at a small shop. Local legend has it that when he ran out of real cargo, he planted fakes so that the show could go on. Well, over the years, the iron hull sank into the sand and the masts washed away, so there's nothing left to see of the Cyndia, but you can still see some of the artifacts, including some of the real cargo, at the Ocean City Historical Museum, which shares that building with the city library. Of course, most ships that wrecked along the Jersey Shore were not as lucky as the Cyndia. They didn't come aground on the beaches. They struck submerged sandbars 100 yards or more offshore. And impossible to launch the ship's boats under those conditions. Most sailors back then couldn't swim. So in the 1870s, the United States Treasury created the United States Lifesaving Service to rescue sailors and passengers after shipwrecks. They built stations like this one, which you'll find at Sandy Hook, all along our coasts, one about every 3 to 5 miles. The first floor was the boathouse, where they stored all the equipment they needed. Upstairs, you had living quarters for between 6 and 8 men. And there was always a watchtower, so that the captain of the station could see for miles along the ocean, could watch for ships that might be sailing too close to shore, might be in danger of running aground. They would try to warn those ships using flags, or after dark with lanterns or flares. Every night, 2 men at a time would leave the station to patrol the beach, one walking north, one walking south. And most mornings, the entire crew would practice launching these surf boats. That's how they would get out to the stranded ships. And they could launch these in almost any weather. But there were times it was too stormy even to get these in the water. That's when they would use a small cannon on the beach to shoot the end of a rope out to the ship. The sailors could tie the end of the rope to one of the masts or some other sturdy part of the vessel, and then using a system of pulleys, the lifesavers would send out what they called the breeches buoy. Nothing fancy, nothing high-tech, This was a life-saving ring with a pair of canvas shorts sewn into it. Designed to bring one person at a time back to shore, Winslow Homer made things a little more dramatic in that painting. The stations also had something called a life car, which could be suspended from the ropes. That was watertight. It held 5 or 6 people at a time. So once the service was well established, hardly any lives were lost along our coast's shipwrecks. Now, there is no longer a United States Lifesaving Service, at least not under its original name. In 1915, it was combined with the older Revenue Cutter Service to form the United States Coast Guard. This is the station in Point Pleasant Beach. There's also a training base down in Cape May. And since 1939, the Coast Guard has been responsible for all United States lighthouses. So, summer's here, time to hit the beach. To keep things simple, we're just going to start in the north and we'll work our way south. Until Fort Hancock closed in the 1970s, and most of the buildings, the barracks and officers' houses, have sat empty ever since, the only part of Sandy Hook that had been open to the public was a small, privately owned resort town down near the southern end of the Hook, a place called Highland Beach, which actually had a swimming beach on the Atlantic Ocean and another on the shore of the Shrewsbury River. Now, Highland Beach no longer exists because in the early 1960s, the state bought it and knocked it down to create a short-lived Sandy Hook State Park. That also no longer exists because it was absorbed by the National Recreation Area in the 1970s. But the town and later the state park were located about where the park entrance and the southernmost parking lots are today. Heading south from there, just a few miles down the road, you might spot a large red windmill. Okay, it was built in the 1960s as a hot dog and hamburger stand. Still there, I've eaten there a few times. But I show it because it is one of the more familiar landmarks in the city of Long Branch. And Long Branch has a long history. It's one of the shore's oldest resorts. Was known for its high sandy bluff that long ago eroded away, but also for large hotels and fashionable visitors. One of the things Long Branch had going for it was that it was easy to get to from New York City. By the 1860s, you could take a steamship from Manhattan. You would dock along Sandy Hook Bay, and from there it was just a short ride by train into Long Branch. For a time, those steamships would also serve the other towns along the Raritan Bay shore, places like Keansburg and Monmouth Beach. By the 1880s, the trip to Long Branch was getting even easier. That's when the city had an ocean pier, 800 feet long. Ships could tie up at the end of the pier. Visitors could walk directly from the ship to their hotel. There is no longer a pier in Long Branch. The last one was lost to a fire in the 1980s. But the modern oceanfront development of shops and restaurants and apartments is still called Pier Village. Now, in its 19th century heyday, Long Branch attracted wealthy New Yorkers, Broadway stars, high-stakes gamblers, and summer of 1861, the First Lady of the United States, Mary Todd Lincoln. After spending a few weeks in Long Branch, she returned to Washington, D.C. and told everybody she knew there what a great town this was, how much she had enjoyed her visit. Well, if you've ever spent any time in the nation's capital during the summer, you know how hot and humid it can get there. So people that worked for the government began spending part of their summers up in Long Branch. And in 1869, President himself arrived. Ulysses S. Grant liked Long Branch so much, he would make it his summer home for the rest of his life. While he was president, during the summers, he would do a lot of work, including holding meetings, on the front porch of that rented cottage overlooking the beach and the ocean. On his spare time, he liked to ride his carriage on the beach, sometimes a little too fast, liked to play cards with his friends, and when they started up horse racing nearby at Monmouth Park, he would go to watch the races. They soon had so many people showing up at the track just hoping for a glimpse of the president, the owners put a statue of him right outside the gate. Well, Grant would be the first of 7 presidents to summer in Long Branch. He was followed by former Ohio Governor Rutherford Hayes, then by James A. Garfield. He died in Long Branch in September of 1881. Chester Arthur, he had been Garfield's vice president. Benjamin Harrison, He also vacationed in Cape May some years. William McKinley. And then the last president to summer in Long Branch was a former New Jersey governor. Woodrow Wilson ran his 1916 presidential re-election campaign from a suite of offices above a bank in Asbury Park. He spent that summer at an estate called Shadow Lawn. The house on the screen burned down a few years later. The building that replaced it, also a mansion, is now part of Monmouth University and easily recognizable because in the early 1980s, it doubled as Daddy Warbucks Mansion in the film version of the Broadway musical Annie. Incredibly, none of the homes or hotels these presidents stayed at are still standing. In fact, this is the only building still associated with them, the former St. James Chapel out on Ocean Avenue. Because they all attended services here, it became known as the Church of the Presidents. It was later converted to a historical museum, but that's now been closed for quite a few years, supposedly for renovations. The only other reminders of what used to be called our summer capital are the oceanfront Seven Presidents Park and this statue of President Garfield staring out to sea. Now, I mentioned earlier that it took a while for the shore to become a vacation spot because it was so difficult to get to. But for some of the people who started 19th century ocean resorts, the difficulty of getting there was kind of a feature of the place. For example, in 1870, the Ocean Grove Camp Meeting Association set out to create a Methodist religious retreat well separated from the temptations of the busier world. So the blue laws you might remember there, not being able to drive in town on a Sunday, they go back way before the automobile. Even in President Grant's day, if you went to Ocean Grove on a Sunday, the horse and carriage had to stay outside of town. I guess it's easier to enforce laws like that when you're separated from the neighboring towns by lakes, and you can just close the bridges. When Ocean Grove started, it was just a tent colony, and there are still about 100 of these tents there. Some have been used by the same families for generations. They're gathered near the Great Auditorium, which was built in the center of town in the 1890s, built to seat about 9,000 people. But the building is so well designed that even though it's built entirely of wood, there are no interior columns, nothing to block your views. The front of the building was extended a bit in the early 1900s, but that was just to make room for what was then the world's largest pipe organ, 8,000 pipes. I was in Ocean Grove a few years ago, weekday morning. They had the auditorium doors open while the organist was rehearsing, and you could go in and listen. If you get the opportunity, that is one incredible instrument. Now, somebody who really liked Ocean Grove as it was just getting started was a factory owner down from New York. He owned a brush factory. His name was James Bradley. He leased himself 2 lots in town. To this day, the Camp Meeting Association still owns all of the property. Bradley then decided he wanted to protect the Grove. He didn't want some noisy resort next door with amusement park rides. He certainly didn't want the drinking and dancing and gambling going on up in Long Branch. So he bought the property just north of town, about 500 acres to begin with. Overgrown so badly that he had to cut a path to the beach with a machete, but the work would pay off. He named his new town after the first Methodist bishop in the United States, Francis Asbury. And by the early 1900s, Asbury Park was becoming one of the more popular resorts on the shore. But Bradley wanted to keep the place very quiet and refined, and okay, he was a bit eccentric. He had signs up on the beach and the boardwalk telling you what you could and couldn't do, what you had to wear, and some of the other business people in town were starting to feel that Bradley was holding them back. They wanted to turn Asbury Park into the Atlantic City of the North. So in 1903, they convinced him to sell all of his property, which at that time still included the beach, the boardwalk, and the boardwalk pavilions. After selling, Bradley turned his back on Asbury Park. Could have retired, but he had other plans. He'd also bought some property just south of Ocean Grove, so he spent his later years developing another resort there, which he named after himself. That one has been Bradley Beach ever since. Now, like a lot of places on the Jersey Shore, Asbury Park had a building boom in the 1920s. At the south end of the boardwalk, it gave us these buildings overlooking Wesley Lake, which separates Asbury from Ocean Grove. The round building to the left was the Carousel House. no carousel any longer. It's used sometimes as an art gallery, sometimes as a performance space. The main building behind it they called the casino, back when that did not necessarily mean a place for gambling. And the building with the tower. That was a heating plant for other buildings along the boardwalk. You actually had pipes running from there underneath the boards all the way up to the Paramount Theater Convention Hall in the north. This was built in the late 1920s, recently restored inside and out, new shops and restaurants. Right across the street from there, the 8-story Berkeley Carteret Hotel opened in 1924, named after the first owners of what became the state of New Jersey, and designed by the same architects who designed the boardwalk pavilions. They also designed New York City's Grand Central Terminal. The statue I showed a few slides back of James Bradley stands in that park in front of the hotel. The great amusement parks in Asbury Park are long gone. This postcard shows the original Palace Amusement Complex overlooking the lake. Back in the late 1800s, they did not call that a Ferris wheel. That was an observation roundabout. And it stopped at the top so you could step off on that platform for the views. The author Stephen Crane, best known for The Red Badge of Courage, grew up in Asbury Park, started his career writing for society columns in newspapers, and wrote very sarcastically of what he called the lunatics riding that thing. But although these parks are long gone, they are not forgotten. Tilly is practically the city's unofficial mascot. It's actually based on the early 20th century logo of a Coney Island entrepreneur named George Tilliou, who opened one of his steeplechase amusement parks in Asbury in 1913. Well, the steeplechase park burned down in 1940 and was never rebuilt. Jump ahead to the 1950s, and new owners are expanding Palace Amusements, and they want to decorate the outside with something to remind people of the good old days before the war, before the Depression. So they kind of adapted Tilliou's logo. And Palace Amusements was torn down in 2004, but you'll still see Tilly grinning on the side of the Wonder Bar and on every sort of Asbury Park merchandise. I've also read that the sections of concrete with his face on it from Palace may be in storage somewhere and may yet reappear. And although Asbury Park has certainly had its share of hard times, the city was already becoming the center of the Jersey Shore rock music scene when the Boss named his first album after the place back in 1973. Maybe not exactly what James Bradley had in mind, but at least along the boardwalk, they have had quite a revival down there in recent years. Continuing south out of Bradley Beach, you've got Avon by the Sea, named after the town in England where Shakespeare lived. But down there on the Jersey Shore, the area's first big property owner thought that would be a good place to grow tobacco and to manufacture cigars. Luckily, his business partners talked him into starting a resort instead. Cross the old drawbridge over the Shark River Inlet, drive down through Belmar, and you come to one of the prettiest towns along the shore. Spring Lake oceanfront used to be lined with giant grand hotels built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Only one of them is still standing. Opened in 1914, the owners named it after the streets on either side. They called it the Essex and Sussex Hotel. Well, that hotel actually closed in 1985. The building then sat empty for about 15 years, and during that time it really looked like we might lose this landmark. But it was fully refurbished and in 2000 opened as a condominium. Spring Lake also has one of my favorite non-commercial boardwalks, just a place where you can go for a good long walk and actually see and hear the ocean. The next town south of there has the last live-in lighthouse built on the shore. The Seagirt Light was built in 1894 to mark a small inlet. By the 1940s, ocean tides had filled the inlet with sand, so the Coast Guard decided the light was no longer needed, shut it down, and in the 1950s gave the building to the town. It was used for a while as a library and a community center. Since the 1980s, it's been a historical museum, usually open on Sunday afternoons during the summertime. Continuing south across the Manasquan Inlet will bring us to the town of Point Pleasant Beach, home to one of our state's last commercial fishing fleets, as well as about a mile-long boardwalk. It was 1928 when a man named Charles Jenkinson came down from Asbury Park, where he'd been running a soda fountain. He built a boardwalk pavilion and then began to expand the business in the 1930s. Added a swimming pool, a dance hall, miniature golf course, of course. And then in the 1940s, his son Orlo began adding the first rides for children, including a miniature train out on the beach. What many visitors may not realize is that the Jenkinson family sold those businesses in the 1970s, but that later owners have kept their name in place because it is almost synonymous with that of the town. The northernmost on a long, narrow strip of land called the Barnegat Peninsula also includes places like Ocean Beach, Lavalette, Ortley Beach, Seaside Heights. The first seaside boardwalk opened in 1921. And this was one of the places hardest hit by Superstorm Sandy back in 2012. Hard to believe that was 10 years ago. But you can't keep a shore town down for long. Although the amusement piers were lost to that storm, new attractions have been built in their place. Not much happening there when I took this picture back in February, but south of there you've got the longest stretch of undeveloped shoreline in the state. 10 miles of beaches and dunes. They call it Island Beach State Park. Great place to go if you'd like to escape the commotion of the boardwalk towns, or just see what the shore looked like before it was so built up. Just one road running down the center of Island Beach. From the end of that road, if you walk to the tip of the peninsula, you can look across the Barnegat Inlet at the Marys Lighthouse, which has its own state park on the other side at the north end of Long Beach Island. Both the lighthouse and the state park are protected by a stone jetty about a quarter of a mile long, because that name, Barnegat, came from a Dutch phrase that meant the Inlet of Breakers, which is what a Dutch sea captain, Cornelius Jacobsen May, called the spot in the early 1600s. Right around the same time, he named the southern tip of our state after himself. That's been Cape May ever since. In 1910, a ship called the Fortuna ran aground about halfway down Long Beach Island. That's her anchor in front of the town hall in the town of Ship Bottom. And okay, I have to admit it, it was strange town names like that that were one of the things that started me looking into the history of the Jersey Shore. I mean, who calls their town Ship Bottom? Well, it turns out that about 100 years earlier, another ship had grounded on almost the same spot. That one wasn't even noticed until the following morning. It was spotted by a captain sailing out of Tuckerton. As he was passing Long Beach Island, he saw just the overturned hull of a ship washed up on the beach. Went ashore, rescued the one survivor he found. I've never found the name of that ship, or the captain, or the survivor, but that part of the island has been called Ship Bottom ever since. Another town on the island owes its name to the Lifesaving Service. All of those stations were numbered, but they were also usually named after the nearest town, which was a bit of a problem on Long Beach. The name fits. It is the longest island on the shore, about 18 miles. And a lot of it would not be developed until about the middle of the 20th century. So as they were building one of these stations, there's no nearby town to name it after. The sign at the nearest railroad stop was no help. That identified an old hotel. The sign said Clubhouse. Down at the Treasury, that didn't sound like a good name for the new station. So they went back to the maps. In the bay behind Long Beach were some smaller islands, and some of those were named after the people who owned them, including a Thomas Lovelady. So they called it the Loveladies Island Life-Saving Station, and when the developer showed up in the 1940s, that's where the town of Loveladies got her name from. As for nearby Harvey Cedars, visitors used to be told that the town was named for Daniel Harvey, a hermit who long ago lived in a stand of cedars that no longer exists. Yeah, most modern historians do not believe that Daniel Harvey ever existed. They trace the name back to some early advertising for the island, where that section was labeled Harvest Cedars. And somewhere along the way, Harvest got shortened to Harvey. The island's busiest town has always been Beach Haven, down near the southern end. The mile-long boardwalk that you see in this old postcard no longer exists. That was swept away by the hurricane of September 1944 and never rebuilt. All the wood that they salvaged, they sold to the city of Atlantic City so they could rebuild their boardwalk. Also long gone are the grand hotels of the late 1800s. Upper left corner, that was the Hotel Baldwin that opened in 1883. Because of the turrets on top of its towers, in its later years, locals nicknamed this Dracula's Castle. Burned down in 1960. Lower right corner, that was the Angleside Hotel, opened in 1876, named after its owner, Robert Angle. This one was actually torn down in the early 1940s after sitting empty for a few years. Seems they had been losing a lot of their business to newer and trendier hotels, including the Baldwin. But Beach Haven is still where you'll find most of the island's shops and restaurants and attractions, including the Long Beach Island Museum. That was built as an Episcopal church back around 1880, converted to a museum in 1976. A brigantine was a type of sailing ship commonly seen along the Atlantic coast, but Brigantine is also the name of the island just north of Atlantic City. This is what it looks like from the top of the Amusements Lighthouse. 1926, a land developer built himself a rather distinctive sales office out there, but the stock market crashed a few years later and put an end to his plans. So this was later used as a police station. To contact cars on patrol, they'd turn on the light at the top of the tower. After that, it served briefly as a souvenir shop. And that also didn't go so well, because if you've been to Brigantine, you'll know that this tower stands on a traffic circle in the middle of the island's busiest intersection. It was never an official lighthouse, never used to guide ships, but it has been restored several times over the years. They do light it every night. I mentioned earlier that it didn't take long for Atlantic City to have some of the biggest and fanciest hotels along the shore. And in 1870, the owners of the early hotels got together to solve a common problem. In the 19th century, people really believed that ocean air could cure you of almost anything. Doctors were prescribing visits to the Jersey Shore. Yes, I still wonder how that note went over when you handed it in at work or school. But people would go down. Atlantic City was advertised as a health resort, and people would go down. They'd take a morning or an evening walk to breathe in the ocean air. They mostly stayed out of the afternoon sunlight. Coming home with a tan did not become fashionable until maybe the 1920s. But all of these morning and evening walks quickly became a problem for the hotel owners, especially when they began installing thick carpets. People were tracking a little too much beach back inside. So they got together and they built the Jersey Shore's first boardwalk. It's only a few feet wide, laid flat on the sand, and it was built in sections. Every September they'd pick it up and put it in storage, bring it back out next year. Did not start building a permanent boardwalk until the early 1880s. The modern boardwalk in Atlantic City is up to 60 feet wide in spots. Now another difference, that original boardwalk, there were no shops. There were no restaurants, there were no amusement parks, there were no casinos. Legal gambling did not arrive in Atlantic City until the 1970s. The other type had been there all along. But before the casinos, the Atlantic City Boardwalk was mostly famous for its many ocean piers. One of the first of those opened up in 1886 as the Iron Pier. If anybody remembers the place, they probably know it by its later name of Heinz Pier, which the food company did use to advertise their pickles and ketchup and whatever made up the rest of the 57 varieties. Heinz Pier was another victim of that 1944 hurricane. If you were looking for something a little more exciting than pickles and ketchup, you could stop in at George Tilyou's Steeplechase Pier. Steeplechase became known as the funny place because he had all sorts of gimmicks and gadgets there that could make you look or feel rather ridiculous. That was part of the fun, and if you really wanted to get into the spirit, they would rent you a clown costume to wear while you were there. 1905, a man named John Lake Young, Captain Young is the way he liked to be addressed, opened the $1 Million Pier. He said he called it that because that's what it cost him to build it. He put in the latest rides and attractions. He booked the most popular bands and orchestras and entertainers. The magician and escape artist Harry Houdini used to perform out there. But Captain Young didn't just run the pier. He didn't just book the entertainment. For the last 30 summers of his life, Captain Young lived on the $1 Million Pier. Designed that house himself. A newspaper reporter described it as filled with marble, some of it real. Young liked to fish from the end of the pier, or from his kitchen window, that's what he would tell visitors. Probably the most famous of the piers was the one that opened in 1898, became known as the showplace of the nation for its theaters and concerts and movies, high-diving horses, General Motors exhibit facing the boardwalk. Unfortunately, the steel pier closed in the 1970s, mostly destroyed by fire in the 1980s. And even in Atlantic City, the summer season tended to end right on Labor Day, until 1921, when the Atlantic City Businessmen's League figured out how to extend the season a full week. They launched the Miss America pageant. The first winner that year, 1921, was 16-year-old Margaret Gorman up from Washington, D.C. The following year, 1922, when the judges included magazine illustrator Norman Rockwell, Mary Campbell took the prize home to Ohio. She also won in 1923, the only contestant to ever win more than once. 1929, the pageant moved into the new Convention Hall, or Boardwalk Hall they call it today, home to the world's largest pipe organ, and that building is so big that during World War II, the Army Air Force used it as a training center. At that point, the troops were practicing the Normandy landings on the Atlantic City beaches. And during the war years, even the largest and newest and fanciest hotels, including the Claridge, the first to advertise as a skyscraper by the sea, these were converted to be used as military hospitals or even barracks. If I've got any Monopoly players in the room, you probably know that all but 2 of the properties on the traditional board are named after Atlantic City streets. The 2 exceptions, Ventnor Avenue is named after the city of Ventnor, located just south of Atlantic City, and Marvin Gardens, and that's actually a misspelling of the name of the street that separates Ventnor from its neighbor to the south, the city of Margate. This is the Old Town Hall and Historical Museum. Both Margate and Ventnor are named after Old English seashore resorts, and we already met Margate's most famous citizen a little earlier in the program. The island just south of Absecon has long been advertised as America's greatest family resort. Inspired by the success of Ocean Grove, in 1879, the Lake family out of Pleasantville established Ocean City. And the Lakes were farmers, land speculators, preachers, and inventors. That's Simon Lake. He was probably the most successful of the inventors. He was only in his teens when his grandfather and his uncles started Ocean City, but he already knew what he wanted to do with his life. A few years earlier, he had read, well, one of my favorite books, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. And he was very impressed by Captain Nemo's submarine, the Nautilus. But he came to believe that he could make a few improvements on the design, and would spend the rest of his life and several fortunes trying to achieve that. And during World War I, got a contract from the U.S. Navy to build us attack submarines. Ocean City also had its building boom in the 1920s. Not really their fault. In 1927, a fire destroyed a lot of the older buildings along the boardwalk. The Music Pier opened in 1928, still hosts a summer concert series. It was 1914 when a man named David Gillian arrived in Ocean City. He was playing drums in a dance band, but he settled down there. He would live to the age of 102. 1930, he opened his first small amusement park along the boardwalk. It was 1956 when his son Roy opened the much larger Wonderland Pier. And you can see that Ferris wheel all the way out on the Garden State Parkway. Early 1970s, the Gillian family bought this antique hand-carved wooden carousel for Wonderland Pier. It was made in 1926 by the Philadelphia Toboggan Company, one of the major carousel producers, and I believe this was one of, if not the very last one they ever made. All of the horses are hand-carved, And at the moment, it's the only classic wooden carousel running on the Jersey Shore. South of Ocean City, you've got Sea Isle City. That was founded in 1880 by Charles Landis. He was also the founder of the city of Vineland in South Jersey. Of course, his plans for Sea Isle, he wanted to create an American Venice with canals instead of streets. By 1885, the Sea Isle City Improvement Corporation mapping out a more traditional ocean resort. You've also got Avalon and Stone Harbor. All of these towns relied very heavily on the railroads. But then the Depression hits. People aren't traveling as much. The railroads begin cutting service on a lot of the seashore lines, eventually closing them down, tearing up the tracks. So, after World War II, people start traveling again. You want to get to the Jersey Shore, you're probably driving. And that could be a long trip. What they called highways in those days were just narrow two-lane roads that crawled through cities and towns, and which crossed rivers and bays on little drawbridges that were constantly being opened to allow boats to pass. Even back then, it was causing major traffic jams in both directions. And from northern New Jersey to Atlantic City could take you 4 to 6 hours. Things did start to change in the mid-1950s with the construction of the Garden State Parkway. The main part of the road was built in just a few years. They held a grand opening ceremony in 1954. These are pages from the Highway Authority's annual report of that year. They held the grand opening that year, even though the final section, running from Paramus up to the New York Thruway, didn't open until 1957. And you can't really say it was completed then. We all know it's still under construction. But the Parkway did make a lot of the shore much more accessible to day trippers, including one of our favorite boardwalk towns. Kind of hard to believe it today, but this name, Wildwoods, that was once an accurate description of what they called 5 Mile Island or 5 Mile Beach. Until the early 1900s, a lot of it was covered with thick forests. The first Wildwood Boardwalk opened in 1895. The modern one, where you have to watch the tram car, please. Those tram cars were built for the 1939 World's Fair out in New York. Well, the modern boardwalk is about 2 miles long. Marys amusement piers have been built up since the early 1970s. But the island's first resort was started about a century before that, early 1870s. It was on the bay side of what's now North Wildwood, a little place called Anglesey. Local legend has it that when the founders of Anglesey learned that the Lighthouse Board was planning to build a tower to mark the nearby Hereford Inlet, they asked, "Can you make it an attractive building that will not hurt our property values?" Probably just legend, but the Hereford Inlet Lighthouse, built in 1874, still in operation, definitely one of the most distinctive along the Jersey Shore. Since the 1980s, it's been preserved as a museum where you can see what it would be like to live or work at one of these lighthouses. Of course, when you think of the Wildwoods, the architecture that probably comes to mind are the many colorful motels built in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And these were made for the automobile travelers. So along with the sun decks and swimming pools, you've got parking lots. You also had these miles of neon signs. Unfortunately, around the turn of this century, developers had started to buy up some of these old buildings and tear them down to build condominiums or enormous homes. And some of the business people in town decided, you know, this look, this style, it's what makes the Wildwoods unique. It's what people are coming to see. So they started the DooWop Preservation League. They nicknamed the architectural style after the pop music of the early 60s. They call it DooWop architecture. And they have a small museum across from the boardwalk. Outside, you can see neon signs from some of those motels that had been torn down. They like to call that their neon sign garden. Well, if you are driving the Parkway, to get to our final stop, you've got to get off at exit 0. That's what the sign says. But people have been visiting Cape May since long before the Parkway, long before the railroads. People have been going there since the 1690s. It was easy to get to. You could sail down the Delaware River and along the shore of Delaware Bay from Philadelphia or the other industrial cities along that river, or you could sail up the Atlantic coast into Delaware Bay. Ferry service to southern Delaware did not start until the 1960s, Although there was a company called National Navigation that tried to launch a ferry service in the 1920s. As part of their dock in Cape May, they bought one of a dozen experimental cargo ships commissioned during the First World War. The name of the ship should have been a warning. It was called the Atlantis. These were made of reinforced concrete. Oh, they did float, but not a single one of them was launched before the war ended in 1918. A few of them, including the Atlantis, had brief careers as freighters or oil tankers, but they were rather expensive to operate and were all quickly taken out of service. So National Navigation tows the Atlantis up into Delaware Bay, but before they can get it into place, a storm breaks the mooring lines, drives the ship into the shallows where it sticks in the sand. You get a 200 and some foot concrete ship stuck in the sand. There's no moving it. They tried several times, but National Navigation went bankrupt. Not a whole lot left to see anymore. That's the view from Sunset Beach. But because people have been visiting Cape May for so long, they've got some of the shore's oldest hotels down there, including the Shelffont, which opened up in 1876. It's been enlarged a few times since then. They still advertise that the rooms have no clocks, no phones, no televisions, although they did finally break down and install air conditioning and Wi-Fi. Ironically, you can get all that information on their website. And Congress Hall, well, that got its start back in 1816. When Thomas Hughes opened the place, his neighbors and his rivals, well, they laughed at him. They told him, "It's too big. You will never earn your money back." They nicknamed it Tommy's Folly. And if you think that's bad, he called it the Big House. Luckily, he was elected to Congress in the 1820s. That inspired him to change the name. Now, this is not the building that he put up. That one was made entirely of wood, burned to the ground in 1878, but it was rebuilt of brick in time for the following season. That's the landmark that's been there ever since. Composer John Philip Sousa named one of his early marches after the Congress Hall Hotel, after conducting his band there one summer. And the summer of 1890, President Benjamin Harrison called the hotel his Summer White House. And instead of trying to keep up with the times, Cape May tends to embrace the past. So you've got shops and restaurants on the ground floors of the old buildings along Washington Street, which is closed to automobiles to create a pedestrian mall. And in the 1970s, the entire city of Cape May was declared a National Historic District, which has helped preserve hundreds of the Victorian cottages and homes, bed and breakfast inns and hotels. This also brings us to the end of our tour of the Jersey Shore. We'll finish up with a sunset along the bay. Took that down in Wildwood Crest a few years back. I'd like to thank you for coming out tonight. Thank everybody who's watching on television as well. If you visit my website, which is simply kevinwoyce.com, you'll find a full schedule of when I'm speaking, where I'll be, which topics I'll be speaking about. You can also follow me on Facebook at Kevin Woyce Author or Instagram at Kevin Woyce. And on the website, you'll find links and information for the regional history books I've written and illustrated, including Jersey Shore History and Facts, and several others that you can find on both Amazon and Barnes & Noble as paperbacks or ebooks. Once again, let me thank you for being here tonight. Hope you enjoyed it. If we've got any questions, I'll do my best to try to answer those. Did we have any? Thank you.
Nuclear power plants down the shore. There's one right before Ocean City. Is that still operating?
That's something I have to look into. I've had people swear that that's not nuclear, although it certainly looks like it. But it's not something I've looked into.
The one in Lacey, I think they had to shut it because it was leaking.
Oh. Yeah, as I said, those I don't really know the story on those. Maybe the next time I do an update, I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, a little scary to me.
Yeah. Yes.
Great presentation, Kevin. A couple questions.
Thank you. Yeah.
First is, so where did the phrase "down the shore" come from? I mean, what does it mean to Jersey?
Nobody seems to know why we refer to it as the shore rather than the beach or the coast or any of the other words used elsewhere. The down the shore part of it seems to come from the fact that in, say, the mid 1800s, you went up to the cities, Philadelphia, New York, so you were headed down to the shore. So that's where the down the shore part comes from, but nobody really knows why it's the shore. That's just one of those things we've come to accept.
Yeah, because you definitely know when someone calls it the beach, then you know that you know. Second question,
Yeah.
you mentioned about the pipe organ in Boardwalk Hall.
Yes.
Is that still active?
I believe it is, yeah.
Is that the largest pipe organ in the world?
Whether it's still the largest, I'm not sure, but it's definitely one of them.
And you also mentioned about the trains that would go down to, I guess, Cape May or Avalon Storm.
Yeah, you used to be able to get all the way down. Every so often after a storm, you can still see some of the tracks down by Cape May. And it shows you just how much beach we've lost to erosion over the years, that they're out that far.
And that would be direct service from Philadelphia, or was it from
You had railroads coming from, most of the southern part of the shore was developed by and for Philadelphia. The northern part of the shore would have served more New York City, northern New Jersey travelers. Yes?
My mother used to tell me that the hotel that was by the Paramount Theater in Asbury Park during the World War II, they made it so that at night they had to close all their...
Oh yeah, during the World Wars, German submarines were operating just offshore, and so you had they had blackouts where all the lights, not just the buildings, but like anything on the boardwalks, all the lights had to be turned down. Even the lighthouses were shut down, and the reason for that was that if the shoreline was lit up, all these submarines had to do was hang out offshore, and they could see our ships, freighters and oil tankers, heading to New York. They could see them silhouetted against all those lights, and that made them really easy targets. So that's what the blackouts were for. It wasn't so much to protect anything on shore, because that's not why they were out there. They weren't trying to attack. But if everything was lit up, those ships were just silhouetted against the lights, and so that's why the blackouts were in effect. They got a lot of complaints from the people that were running like boardwalk businesses and stuff, because the lights are a big part of those businesses, but it was necessary for those few years. And I think even the lighthouses were shut down. Yes.
Where would you say technically the shore begins? Because I know there's some small beaches like in South Amboy.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly followed just the ocean front. So when I think of the Jersey Shore, I think of Sandy Hook down to Cape May Point. Some people would also include the whole Raritan Bay Shore area there. So, you could include that. And even when they give you the measurement of, the most commonly quoted number is 127 miles, but how exactly they've measured that, I'm not sure.
I
Yeah.
recently heard or read that Frank Sinatra, you're talking about Long Branch, Frank Sinatra met his wife in Long Branch?
Oh, that I wasn't aware of. Which wife?
Nancy.
Okay. Is there what, about 3 or 4 of them? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you had all the big performers played all along the shore in those days. So, well, if we don't have any more, thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.